Well, hello and welcome back to Principles of Macroeconomics. I am still your host, Dr. B. Happy to have you with us today as we talk about macroeconomic theory and the open economy. Before we jump into our conversation on that, I just do want to call your attention to where we are in the classroom, and also to first and foremost apologize about being absent for the past 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference, and then last week, of course, got sick from the fancy COVID. So I was kind of down and out. So I apologize first and foremost about missing those two sessions, and hopefully the recorded videos that I posted helped you in your endeavors there. So again, sincerely apologize about missing those last 2 weeks. Um, so yeah, I'm feeling much better. So thank you all for the well wishes. I had a pretty nasty bout with the COVID last week. And then the prior week I was at a conference. So it's it always seems to work that way, doesn't it? You go to a massive event and then you get sick. So again, apologize about that. But I'm happy to have you with us as we're already in week 13, which is where we are today. We'll be talking about macroeconomic theory in the open economy. And to accompany today's lecture, today's discussion, we will have a discussion board for this week, and we will also have, of course, the quiz to accompany the chapter. So, as always with all the discussion boards in this course, I really would like you to have your original discussion posted by Wednesday night. Yep, during the normal class time. So if you could have your original post done by Wednesday night, that would be fantastic. For this discussion board, I am looking for a one sentence response to each question. There are 10 questions. Okay, so that means 10 sentences for your original post. And then I want you to respond to two of your classmates. Yeah. That'll make for a really, really good discussion. So your original discussion post should be done on this coming Wednesday, and then your two responses should be done by Sunday. And you're answering each question, each of the 10 questions, one sentence per question. And that'll help you to solve the discussion forum. So again, this Wednesday, original response to the discussion board, you'll answer each question. There are 10 questions, one sentence per question. And then by Sunday, you responded to your classmates by asking them questions or whatever. So that'll be the discussion board. And then, of course, you'll have the Chapter 19 quiz to accompany that as well, due on Sunday as well. So let's go ahead and jump into it, and we'll talk about macroeconomic theory and the open economy. Let me go ahead by starting this and switching this as I always have to do with the display settings. Apologize about that. It always seems to do that to me. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. As you know, throughout the past 12 weeks, we have been looking at macroeconomics. Macroeconomics, as you know, is the study of the economy from a national perspective. We've been looking at everything at a macro scale. We've talked about things like gross domestic product. We've talked about things like international trade, etc. In looking at an open economy, we look at it from the lens of macroeconomics. Because in an open economy, we look at how two or more countries trade with each other. yeah, through international trade. So this really builds on what we learned about earlier with international trade and those types of conversations we've had. So in looking at an open economy, we look at how two or more countries trade with each other, and we also look at economic forces like trade balance and exchange rates. As you recall, when we talked about the monetary system, we discussed a concept called exchange rates. An exchange rate is when we exchange a dollar for another form of currency. So, for example, I would take $1, go to the exchange rate, the exchange market, and purchase a euro. But it's not dollar for dollar. You see, for example, $1 will get me 90 cents in euro. Okay. $1 will get me $1.10 Canadian. $1 will get me roughly 10 pesos Mexican. $1 will get me 100 yen in Japan. $1 will get me 80 cents British pound. Okay. The reason for the difference is because of the exchange rates. Okay. The open economy looks at these exchange rates, and we also look at what we call market for loanable funds and foreign currency exchange. The market for loanable funds, as you recall from our discussion on monetary policy and things like that, is that loanable funds are where an individual or a bank or business has funds available to loan. The way it typically works is that individuals like you and I deposit funds into our bank account, our savings, checking. The bank then loans those funds to other individuals or to businesses. And that's where the money comes from. It comes from the savers, right? Remember? That same principle applies to foreign exchange. Loanable funds are intertwined with foreign exchange when there's an open economy. Okay? For example, an individual might come from Canada with Canadian dollars, deposit those funds, and then are lent American dollars in exchange. You see? The difference is the exchange rate. And there's usually a couple fees. So the concept of the open economy is to look at trade, international trade, two or more countries, how that trade balances out through gross domestic product formula. And we look at the exchange rate, which is the exchange of one currency for another. In an open economy, the formula for loanable funds is savings equals domestic investment plus net capital outflow. Savings equals investment plus net capital outflow. Remember, net capital outflow is the inflow minus the outflow equals the net capital outflow. Inflow minus outflow equals net capital outflow. So savings equals domestic investment plus net capital outflow is the definition formula of an open economy for loanable funds. The money comes from savings. Kind of like the earlier example I gave you, where our savings are used for loanable funds when we put it into the bank. Same principle applies here. The national savings is used as loanable funds. The demand for those loanable funds domestically comes from investments and net capital outflow. So savings equals investment plus net capital outflow, right? The savings equals the loanable funds. That's what this overall tells us. When the net capital outflow is greater than zero, we have the ability to, of course, purchase capital overseas. What we mean by that is when the net capital outflow is greater than zero, we can exchange those American dollars for a foreign currency. The net purchase of capital overseas. This adds to the demand for domestically generated loanable funds. Why did the demand go up? Because there would be less capital because of the exchange, you see. When net capital outflow is less than zero, we have resources coming from abroad. This reduces the demand for domestically generated loanable funds. Net capital outflow is less than zero. Less people are going to be generating loanable funds domestically. That's what that tells us. For all intents and purposes, I mean, you don't have to memorize these formulas. This isn't going to be, this will probably be one or two questions on your homework assignment or your quiz, but it's not something to dwell on. But it's just important to know this because ultimately when we're talking about international trade, we're talking about foreign exchange, these types of concepts come up because we need to know, hey, where's the money coming from and who needs it? That's why it's important. The availability of loanable funds is based on the domestically generated flow of resources available from capital accumulation. Fancy way of saying the funds that are produced locally are available when we deposit it into the bank to be loanable. Real simple. Yeah. We save cash. We put it into the bank account. The bank lends those funds to others. Loanable funds. That's where the loanable funds come from. Loanable funds are often used to purchase capital assets. Capital assets, as you recall from accounting, are things like property, plant, and equipment. They're used to produce. Yep. This adds to the demand of loanable funds when there's a purchase of capital assets. These assets are typically located domestically, property, plant, and equipment, and they could also be located internationally or abroad through net capital outflows. Some companies are international, and you know quite a few of them. Coca-Cola, one of the largest international companies in the world. Coca-Cola is produced in South America, North America, Asia, Europe, pretty much everywhere. Yeah. Every country you go to, they know the name Coca-Cola because it's produced and consumed pretty much around the world. Because Coca-Cola has a lot of international operations, they need to purchase capital assets, property, plant, and equipment, in order to produce their product in multiple countries. Yep. It's a multinational corporation. Because it's a multinational corporation, it has property, plant, and equipment invested in the United States and abroad. Yeah. The investments and the net capital outflows. It uses loanable funds to do those things. Interest rates have a dramatic impact on loanable funds. This year, 2023, we have very high interest rates. Higher interest rates encourages people to save more. Why? Because your money makes money once in the bank through interest. We call it accrued interest. When the more cash you have in the bank, the more interest you earn. Yeah, pretty straightforward. Yeah. So higher interest rates encourage people to save more. Absolutely. Which increases the availability of loanable funds. Because remember, the banks use the cash that they have on hand in the bank to loan to others. However, higher interest rates also discourage investment. It's real expensive to buy a house right now in the United States. Why? Because the 30-year mortgage interest rate is well above 8%. It's closer to 9. It might even hit 10. We haven't seen interest rates this high in 25 years. Okay? So it's a concern. Those types of high interest rates, it discourages people from wanting to buy houses. Yeah, they'll rent longer because of the higher interest rates. Very true. So it discourages investment from that perspective. So they're not going to be taking out a mortgage. The loanable funds, the demand will be lower. Yeah. Same principle applies to business. Because of the high interest rates, companies do not want to expand. They can't afford to because the interest rates are so high. You see? It also, the higher interest rates, discourage Americans from buying foreign assets. Here's what I mean by this. Coca-Cola is an international company called a multinational corporation. They have operations throughout the world. The company will probably not expand during times of high interest rates because it would reduce the U.S. net capital outflow. Yeah. It makes things a little harder for them to expand. The higher interest rates also encourage people from outside the United States to buy U.S. assets. This reduces U.S. net capital outflow. Here's what I mean by this. In prior years, other countries like China, Brazil, and a few other nations purchased a lot of property in the United States for the intention of developing that property. One of the best examples I can give you of this is in Miami, Florida. In Miami, China purchased several large pieces of land and developed very large apartment buildings on those pieces of land. This was when, at a time, there a lot of different countries were interested in property in the United States. At that time, it was just before the housing market collapsed in 2008. And so what happened was China bought these pieces of property. They built these beautiful high-rise buildings. And those buildings sat empty for a long time, many, many years. It wasn't until recently that they had to rebuild some of them, and they're still not even at full occupancy. Yep. So higher interest rates, it's good for outside nations to come into the United States and purchase. However, the opposite is not true. Higher interest rates really does hurt the entire economy. When we look at loanable funds, the supply curve is upward sloping. Okay? Supply curve is upward sloping and to the right. The demand curve is downward sloping and to the right. The point of equilibrium is, of course, where supply and demand intersect. The point of equilibrium for interest rates is the amount that people want to save, and it balances with the quantity supplied. Okay? Where supply and demand meets. That's the equilibrium point. Here's an example of the supply and demand curve for loanable funds. We see the real interest rate and the equilibrium interest rate. Equilibrium interest rate intersects with the equilibrium of the quantity of the funds available. So the real interest rate is on the y-axis. On the x-axis, we have the quantity of funds, total available dollars to be lent. Right? So, it's an interesting graph. Why is it interesting? Because the equilibrium point eventually changes along with the interest rate, right? As the interest rate goes down, the supply comes down, but the demand goes up, right? So that's interest rates and loanable funds. Since we're talking about the open economy, we have to talk about foreign exchange currency. Okay. Foreign exchange currency, also known as foreign currency exchange, is the exchange for one currency for another. For example, $1 US to $1 Canadian. $1 US is $1.10 Canadian. $1 American to a euro is 90 cents euro. $1 American to the British pound is 80 cents for the pound. $1 American to the Japanese yen is, I think it's about 90 yen right now, thereabouts. We call this foreign currency exchange. One exchange for one currency for another. There's a market for this, okay, where there's a constant buying and selling of currency. And the reason why that market exists is because of the gains based off of the rates. Yep. This type of market, the foreign currency exchange market, it looks like this. It's net capital output equals net exports. Net capital output or outflow equals net exports. When there's a trade surplus, the net exports are greater than zero. Makes perfect sense. Sending stuff out of the country is greater than zero. Net exports, yep. That's a trade surplus. This occurs when, of course, your exports are greater than your imports. You have a trade surplus. This also means that the sale of goods and services are made abroad, and that Americans use the foreign currency to buy foreign assets. Travel, basically, yeah. When the capital, the money, is flowing abroad in other countries, US dollar in other countries, the net capital outflow is greater than zero. All these things together mean we have a trade surplus, which we don't here in the United States. We do not have that currently. We currently have a trade deficit. Our imports are greater than our exports. This means our net exports are less than zero. Some of the spending is financed by selling American assets abroad. For example, it's very common for American-made goods to be sold in Asia, Europe, and around the world. Depends on what it is, right? You name it. There's a lot of different things that you can buy in another country that's made in the U.S. Sometimes the price for those goods, believe it or not, are even less than if you bought them here. This stems from foreign capital flowing into the United States. Happens very often when the U.S. economy is not as strong as other nations. Travelers from other countries come to the United States, purchase U.S. goods, bring them back home. This means we have a trade deficit. The net capital outflows are less than zero. When we look at the supply of the currency, a foreign currency, we look at things like net capital outflow and the supply curve. The net capital outflow, the quantity of the dollars applied to buy foreign assets is what we're looking at. So, how many US dollars are being used to purchase foreign assets? That's net capital outflow when we're looking at the foreign currency exchange. We also look at the supply. How much dollars are being supplied for the net capital outflow? This does not depend on the exchange rate. Does not depend on the exchange rate. The amount of the supply does not depend on the exchange rate. Okay. It depends on the net capital outflow. So that's the supply side. What about the demand? The demand is based off of net exports. The quantity of the US dollars demanded to buy US net exports of goods and services. So the demand is based off of net exports. it's also based off of the exchange rate. Okay. Demand, as usual, downward sloping to the right, supply upward sloping to the right, and then there's a point of equilibrium, which we'll get to here in a second. The exchange rate has an effect on demand. It makes U.S. goods and services more expensive when the exchange rate is higher. It also reduces the quantity of the dollars demanded when the exchange rate is higher. Makes sense. Higher rates, lower demand. Lower rates, higher demand. The point of equilibrium for foreign currency exchange is where supply and demand meet, of course. The demand for US dollars is based off of individuals from outside the United States and U.S. net exports of goods and services. The balance of supply and demand also comes from, of course, individuals within the country and net capital outflow. So here we see the market for foreign currency. We have the real exchange rate on the y-axis. On the x, we have the quantity supplied being exchanged into foreign currency, where the quantity and the demand meet is the point of equilibrium, which is identified as the real exchange rate. So that was the discussion on the exchange rate. Exchange rates, you'll notice, are very interesting to follow. The reason why I say that is because the US dollar oftentimes acts as what we call the gold standard in exchange rates. And the reason for that is because of the strength of the US dollar. You'll notice that a lot of Caribbean nations follow the US dollar. They're what we call pegged to the US dollar. So, for example, if you go to the Bahamas or if you go to a couple of Caribbean nations, they will either use the US dollar or they'll accept it. And it's pegged, right? So their currency matches our currency. Yeah, that's very common among Caribbean nations. And of course, a lot of it has to do with proximity and tourism and things like that. But also, of course, foreign domestic policy. Okay, so we looked at exchange rates. We looked at the foreign market exchange rates. We looked at a couple of other concepts. So now let's put it all together. So equilibrium in the open economy. As you know, the open economy has to do with loanable funds, foreign exchange rates, but obviously trade is the biggest part. So a couple of things we need to remember. The market for loanable funds formula is savings equals investment plus net capital outflow. The market for foreign currency exchange formula is net capital outflow equals net exports. So where do the two come together? Well, there's a link, and it's in the net capital outflow curve. We have the market for loanable funds and the market for foreign exchange currency combined together to represent equilibrium in the open economy. So here's part of it. So we have the interest rate. The real interest rate represented here on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have the net capital outflow. We see the slope going downward and to the right. representing that interest rate based off of capital outflow. Less than zero, it's a net capital outflow is negative, of course. Greater than zero, it's positive. Looking at the market for loanable funds, the supply, which is the savings, equals investment, which comes from demand, plus the net capital outflow. So the market for the supply is the national savings, the demand comes from the investment, and the net capital outflow, based off the formula. The point of equilibrium is the interest rate. So the net capital outflow slopes downward, and the equilibrium point is represented by the interest rate. So that's the market for loanable funds. Now we have the market for foreign currency. The supply is represented by the net capital outflow. The demand stems from the net exports. The point of equilibrium is the exchange rate. So the exchange rate is based off the price of goods and services in present day, and it's relative to goods and services in the future. In other words, we don't account for inflation here. The equilibrium for the exchange rate is based off the price of domestic goods and services. It's relative to the foreign goods and services. In other words, the point of equilibrium for the real exchange rate does not account for differences in the exchange rates. The prices are, quote unquote, the same. The exchange rate and the interest rate adjust simultaneously to balance out loanable funds and the foreign exchange currency. So the exchange rate and the interest rate adjust simultaneously, which helps to determine things like the national savings rate, domestic investment, net capital outflow, and net exports. So looking at the two together, on the left we have the market for loanable funds, real interest rate and the quantity of the funds. We see the supply and demand curve. The point of equilibrium is represented by the interest rate. Next, we have on the right the net capital outflow, which is represented by the interest rate and net capital outflow. The point of equilibrium is, again, the interest rate. On the bottom, we have the market for foreign exchange, and we see supply and demand, the point of equilibrium, of course, being the real exchange rate. So if you look at these in combination, the relationship is the interest rate being the same as the real exchange rate. That's the point of equilibrium. Some other things you need to know that affect open economies. One of those being government budget deficits, which is something the United States has been running for since Bill Clinton was in office. Bill Clinton balanced the budget. That was the last time the United States has seen a balanced budget. Okay. Every presidency thereafter, we've been running a deficit. And the deficit right now, I believe, is something ridiculous like $12 trillion, something like that. It's bad. So anyway, so the government budget deficits, not so good for open economies. This, of course, happens when the government spending exceeds revenue. Government revenue, as you remember, comes from taxes. Government spending comes from spending on things like defense, infrastructure, social programs, etc. Yep. Deficits reflect negative public savings. In other words, the government's not collecting enough revenue. Yep. They're not collecting enough taxes to cover all the expenses. This reduces the national savings rate. It also reduces the supply of loanable funds, as represented through the Federal Reserve. And there is typically associated an increased interest rate because of the deficit. Higher interest rates oftentimes lead to, collection of a little bit more revenue for the government. This also reduces the net capital outflow. So you can see that government budget deficits are a bad thing, for the most part. These deficits also cause what we call crowding out of domestic investment. Simple way of saying less individuals and businesses are willing to invest domestically because of deficits. Yeah, absolutely. Because the interest rates are higher, just overall not a good thing. There's a decrease in the supply of foreign currency exchange. Not a whole lot of foreign investment happening in a country when they're running a deficit on their budget. The currency appreciates in value. So, this part's interesting. The US dollar goes up in value when there's a deficit. Strange, right? You'd think it'd be the other way around. The reason for this is because of the purchasing power the dollar has. That's why the currency appreciates in value. The net exports fall. Yeah, of course it does, because there's not a whole lot being produced locally because there's less investment. And it pushes the trade balance toward a deficit, which we currently have. In the United States, we have a trade deficit plus a government budget deficit, which we've been running for a long time, about 24 years. So what are the other effects graphically? Because of the government budget deficit, of course, this results in less loanable funds due to the higher interest rate. So we see a shift in the supply curve to the left. Equilibrium moves up. Higher equilibrium has an impact on net capital outflow, which, coming down to the real exchange rate, we see the shift in the supply curve to the left. Less supply, higher interest, which also means a higher exchange rate. So government deficits tend to trickle down in a bad way. In open economies, we oftentimes deal with international trade, and international trade is governed by trade policies. These are government policies that are set to directly influence the quantity of goods and services available. Okay? These limitations are set on countries on the country's imports and exports. Oftentimes, these limitations are in the form of what we call tariffs, which is a tax on the imports, and quotas, which is a limit on the quantity of the imports. One of my favorite examples of this is the vehicle manufacturer Toyota, who before the 2000s imported their vehicles from Japan to the United States. there was a quota and a tariff put on these vehicles that limit the number of vehicles coming into the United States from other countries, and also the tariff, the tax on it. Now, why did this happen? Why did the government say, hey, let's tax Toyota on every vehicle that's brought into the United States? The reason for that was to, of course, protect the domestic vehicle manufacturers, to provide them with an advantage, to provide General Motors and Ford and all of the manufacturers here in the United States with an advantage. It helped to, what they said, level the playing field. In theory, it's a nice thought. In practice, it's a little muddy. The idea of import quotas decreases the amount of imports. So Toyota is not bringing a whole lot of cars into the United States because of the import quota. There's an increase in net exports. The local vehicle manufacturers, General Motors, Ford, are exporting their vehicles to other countries. Yeah, a lot of buyers in Asia and Europe at the moment, yeah, and some in South America. There's an increase in demand for dollars in the foreign market exchange. Yeah, mostly true. A lot of individuals coming to the United States for vacation. And then, of course, the real exchange rate goes up, which discourages exports. And one of the last things you need to know about the trade policy is that there's no change in real interest rates from import quotas. Okay? Import quota is simply a limitation on the amount of a particular product coming into the United States, which also results in no change in net capital outflows and no change in net exports. Of course not, because it's coming in. Decrease in imports and exports in totality as a result of an import quota. The effect of import quotas on loanable funds and net capital outflows are the same, so there are really no changes there. The changes that do happen are, of course, on the exchange rates. We see a shift in the demand upward, and that shift in demand, of course, increases the exchange rate. So that's the effect from import quotas. So, how do trade policies affect the overall trade balance? They don't. They really don't. The net exports equals the net capital outflows, which equals savings minus investment. Yeah, it's in balance. That's how we balance the trade. Net exports equals net capital outflows, which equals savings minus investment. Trade policies, of course, have an impact on companies, industries, and countries. For using the earlier example of Toyota being the firm that's impacted, the industry, auto manufacturers, and the countries, Japan and the United States. The limitation that the United States put on the number of imports is a part of a trade policy. I like this quote. If the United States reduced its fiscal deficit, then its trade deficit would also shrink. Yeah, probably. Yeah. Majority of people agree. Yeah, and I agree with that as well. So, one of the many reasons why the United States has such a fiscal deficit is because of political instability. The two-party system that we have here, they don't seem to get along with each other too well, which causes dispute on how to balance a budget. And I think you're all probably well aware of that because the government is, once again, going through a potential shutdown because they cannot pass a budget. It's kind of embarrassing at this point, but that's our politicians hard at work. They can't get along and they can't agree, so it leads to these types of problems, which also leads to something we call capital flight. It's a large and sudden reduction of demand for assets located in a particular country. People have become less interested when there's political instability in that country. This happened in Mexico. 1994, there was a political upheaval at that time, and investors were like, you know what? No, we'll get out of Mexico, go to the United States, safer for investment. At that time, yeah, it was a difficult time for Mexico. So when there's political instability, oftentimes investors don't want to invest in that country when there's political instability. We saw the same thing in Venezuela recently. It happens. It's unfortunate, but it happens. Net capital outflow curve increases at times of political instability, and the supply of that dollar in that country increases. Because less of it's being used for foreign investment. And the demand curve for loanable funds also increases. At that time in Mexico, the interest rate dramatically increased at times of instability. It reduced domestic and foreign investment. It slowed down the capital growth, which in turn, of course, slowed down domestic growth. The peso at the time went down in value, which made exporting cheaper, but importing a lot more expensive, which led to a trade imbalance. So these are just some of the things that happen when there's that type of instability. The interest rates increase, which leads to an increase in net capital outflow, which in turn, of course, leads to a decrease in the supply of the money, reducing the exchange rate. So, that type of instability, it has cause and effect on a relationship that it has with the United States and Mexico at that time. What was happening in the U.S. at the time in 1994 in Mexico, there was a reduction in U.S. capital investment as well. The U.S. dollar appreciated in value, and interest rates in the U.S. went down because it had that relative impact. Because Mexico, as you may know, is the largest trading partner with the United States. Yeah, the U.S. largest trading partner is Mexico. For those of you who don't know that, yeah, that's a fun fact. So what do economists have to say about these kinds of things? A lot of it depends on the exchange rates and what people really think about their trading abilities. So that's the end of our discussion on the open economy. As a reminder for this week, we have a discussion board. Within that discussion board, there are 10 questions that you need to answer, one sentence per question. I would like you to please complete your original discussion post answering these 10 questions by Wednesday night. I'd like you to respond to your class names by Sunday night. The responses don't have to be terribly long, maybe a paragraph or so. And then, of course, there's the chapter quiz that accompanies today's lecture. Okay, one more point of note. I'm a little concerned that some of you may have fallen a little behind in your work. If you have something outstanding, like a quiz or a discussion board or whatever it is, I need you to do it, because, as you know, the only way you can possibly come close to passing this class is to do all the work. When you miss something, you put yourself in jeopardy of failing. Don't fail the class because you didn't do the work. I need you to pass this class. And the only way you can do that is to do the work. So if you're late with stuff, you need to do that right away. Please get it done. Just don't waste any more time. Okay? We don't have much more time left. We're in week 13, y'all. What does that mean? We got next week? We got the week after. And then we're done. So, please, make sure you do all the work for this course. Don't leave anything unturned or not submitted. Please submit your work. Any comments, questions, or concerns? We all doing okay? We're almost done.
I have a question about the final exam.
Yeah, go for it. Tell me.
Is it going to be available to take before the 11th?
Yeah, absolutely. It's open right now.
Oh, okay.
It's been open since you started the class. But yeah, it's if you want to work ahead, you're more than welcome to.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions, comments, concerns about anything? We all doing okay? Yeah, I know it's Monday night. Nancy, how we doing?
No, I just want to say that, yeah, I am doing okay. And
Great.
thank you.
Hey, awesome. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Great. Okay, y'all. Well, thank you all so much for your time today. I sincerely appreciate all of you as always. If you ever need anything, you know you can email me, you can call me, you could even set up office hours. Whatever you need, I am always here for you, and I want you to know that. And I again thank you so much for your time. I appreciate all of you. I look forward to your great progress for this week and for the next 2 weeks as we finish up the course. Thank you so much. If you need anything, email me, call me, set up office hours, and I look forward to everything. Thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of your night. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.